All right, so what we're going to do in this video is take a look at the differences between a bump map, a normal map, and a displacement map. See when we might use one versus another, and we're also going to see how we can take a sculpted object and create pretty much all of those different maps, with the exception maybe of the bump map. Though we will be employing a workaround, as we'll see. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, we have the setup here, a sculpted object that I've made. It's important to point out that the UVs have been laid out on this object. So not perfectly, if I just go to UV edit, but you will see they do not overlap. And that is the most important thing for kind of baking out textures on a sculpted object like this. So we have our sculpt, and what we're going to do is create a bump map, a normal map, and a displacement map, and then go ahead and apply them and see what the end result looks like. And in a separate video, what I might do is take a look at what we can do geometry wise with a sculpted object. Now, whether we want to use a displacer, compare that to a displacement map, things like that. I'm thinking about doing another video there. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, I mentioned this is a sculpted object. And what we would do is to bake this down and create those textures is in your sculpting layout on the highest level, um, choose bake sculpt objects, and that will pull up our baking options here. I've already browsed to kind of tell this where to save, chose the format. Size is obviously important as well. And in the options, you can decide what maps you want to use. So we have our displacement, we have our normal, and honestly, ambient occlusion is going to work pretty much like our bump. Though we'll take a look at the displacement and see if, you know, how good of a job that might do. Now, all I really did on this was set the optimal mapping here to cubic. That's what separated out the different polygons in the UV edit layout, like we just saw. If you've already laid out those polygons, then you can just keep this to off. For the levels I chose, obviously the highest, but I do like to go with level 1 here, just to give a little bit more detail in shape. So with that done, you can go ahead and hit bake. Now I've already, actually, I'll go ahead and do that again, but these textures already exist. So it's going to go through and save them out for us. So that way, um, we have them available to us, and it's going to create a material for us as well. Now, that material is going to be a standard material, and we'll go ahead and create a redshift material from these. So I can close this dialog box now. Here's that new object with the material. Honestly, doesn't look too bad. And really, if we just do start our IPR, we can maybe get a sense of just what the um, normal material looks like. And it doesn't look too bad, right? And a big part of figuring out what map we're going to use and where is how close are we going to be to this? Because the further we are away, the better, or the easier map we can get away with, the bump map versus displacement versus normal. So clearly that almost looks worse the further out we get, which is a bit strange. But go ahead and turn that off for now. And I really don't even need this object. I just want the material, even though it's not perfectly set up for Redshift. So if you want to see, where it puts these textures in a standard material, it sets it up for diffusion. We have our normal, obviously, and then finally displacement. So all pretty straightforward. Even have our subpolygon displacement turned on there. Now to try and convert this material, we can come over to our material options, tools, and choose convert and replace materials. And that will create a Redshift shader graph material based on this. And as you can see, we've lost everything but the displacement map here. Um, so obviously some work to do. While I'm at it, I'm going to just take this one step further and convert and replace it with nodes, which will create the new node editor. All right, I say new, it's been here for a while. And since this is going to be our base material, just go ahead and name this one displacement and just change the settings a little bit. So the color, maybe just a bit darker and a little bit of roughness. All right, actually that's fine. And yep, you can just duplicate this a couple times for bump and then for normal. All right, let's start with the bump. Apply that to our bump cube, which is this one right here. Okay, and open this up. We're not going to need our displacement. I'll drag in um, both the displacement and the ambient occlusion textures. And I just have a Finder, not Finder, Explorer open on another window. You can just drag textures in. One of the reasons why I like doing that is that it names them. Now, what we can do is if we actually kind of preview these, is just get a sense of what this looks like. So this is our ambient occlusion, has some decent detail in it. The displacement, actually, that's interesting. The displacement has colors in it. Should have been black and white. I don't think it was a vector displacement. I suppose it's a possibility. This is also fun, but those are our options. So I'm really confused by that displacement, but we'll take a look at it. So we just want to set up a bump map. We do have to create a bump map node. Not a big fan of that. Really should just be able to plug it in. And if I twirl down the overall section, we can connect that up. And let's start with our ambient occlusion in here. And this is why this isn't necessarily a fair comparison because we don't really get a bump map out of this. But you can see that the bump map actually works pretty good. And that's before I even render this. So let's just kind of dock that there. So we can see this. I don't need that quite this big. Let's start our IPR here and see what we get. Right. So not too bad. And once again, it comes down to how far away we're going to be and how much detail we actually need. Because I would say this doesn't look too bad. And if we were to zoom out, decent amount, right? Still. Now to really kind of put this on the same page, I'm going to create a base material, delete out the textures here, and make sure this goes on the sculpt. So that way we can compare kind of more apples to apples here. And so, yeah, we do see more detail, but once again, is this really worth it? The time to sculpt it, the time to bake out the maps. I guess we don't have to bake out the maps, but the additional geometry we have here, the additional conversion time and extra RAM it takes, video RAM, if we are using something like Redshift. So only you can decide that, but it also depends on what the end result is going to be used for. Um, so, if this is more of a real time uh, thing, video game simulation, we're probably not going to be able to get away with, however many hundreds of thousands of polygons are on this particular object. Okay, now that's where a remesher might be able to help, but bump map wise, that looks pretty good. And honestly, we may be able to push this even further uh, by increasing the strength of our bump map, which we can do in the bump map node. I can see what a strength of 5 looks like. Okay, quite a bit better. All right, so now we're starting to get somewhere. Now, what a bump map actually does is it pretends to give our object here depth and dimension, so it's no longer perfectly smooth. Okay, if you were to take your hand and drag it across that surface, but it's not really changing our geometry. The silhouette of this geometry is the same as it was before this map. If I just disconnect it, it's not actually changing the silhouette. So it really is a fake. Okay, now black values push in, white values push out. And so because we're only working with two, kind of colors there, black and white, we can only push things in and out. And it does so based on the direction of the polygon's normal. Okay, so that's actually what a bump map does. Okay, so let's move on to the normal map now. Get rid of the displacement map here. And in terms of the setup, setting up a normal map is quite similar to what we just did with a bump map. You're still going to use a bump map node. Okay. And you're going to connect it in the same spot. So input, extra input, and oops, in the actual material, can connect it to the bump map section. Okay. Except in our bump map node, we need to switch the map type from height field, which is what we want to do for a bump map, and choose one of our normal options. Now we have two normal options. And in case you were curious what these are about, tangent space is when you would download, say, a map here, a normal map that you would download that is not based on geometry that you've created is going to be that first option, that tangent space normal. In object space normal is going to be what we have here, where we're taking one object that is higher resolution, creating a normal map, and using that normal map on a lower resolution or lower detailed object. Okay, now doesn't mean you can't try the others. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but in reality, it really should be object space normal for this particular setup if you're baking out something sculpted. And if you are downloading something from online, it would be a tangent space normal. So I've created that material. I'm going to apply it and you'll see what we get. Okay, looks interesting, looks a bit different. Okay. Now this is where, really, this is what I would expect. Okay. But that doesn't mean I can't come in here and try my other option. And honestly, that looks a bit better. I'm getting some weird shading here, but we can ignore that since that isn't necessarily kind of the purpose of what this is about. But what we're seeing is, at least on this front here, that the normal map is giving us significantly more detail, more depth and dimension than our bump map. Now, just like a bump map, it's actually not changing the silhouette of our geometry. So this too is a fake. Okay, we're not adding geometry, we're not changing the shape of it. It's just working on the interior of it. But because it does have three colors, all right, we can see some of those colors here. All right, one for each axis, right? Just colors here we see. Um, you can get more detail out of it. And so that is the advantage of a normal map, is you get more detail out of it than a bump map. And so in a perfect world, if I have both of these and I can only use one, I'm going to use a normal map, and you can see exactly why. Now, there really isn't much reason to choose a bump map over a normal map unless you do not have a normal map. And even then, there are ways around it. There are plugins for Photoshop to convert a bump map or a texture into a normal map. There's even a texture in your standard Cinema 4D material. Let's see, those are all Redshift materials, but called Normalizer. I don't know if you can actually, um, let's see, no, let's see if I can, no, not gonna be able to pull it up actually in this scene, but I can in a different one. So in here, if you just, in your normal, you can really use it anywhere, but under, I think it's effects. Yeah, we have Normalizer, and this will take any other texture you put into it and convert a normal map from it. So this was a really, really powerful texture. I think there's a way to get this into Redshift, though you may have to use the shader graph. I would have to look into it. I thought there was a way to do it, but what you can do, if I just convert this here to, where is it? Oh, since I'm not using Redshift, doesn't want to give me those options. Convert and replace. So it may actually, no, it didn't do it, but you have a C4D shader in your shader graph that allows you to use any of, actually, I don't know if it's any, but a lot of Cinema 4D's effects or other textures, and you could drop a normalizer in there. I think that work. Yep. And then kind of do it this way. So this would be kind of a one way you could convert a bump map to a normal map if you absolutely had to. But for the most part, you're not going to get this amount of detail doing that because it still is using the same amount of information, the same base information. Whereas with our sculpt, it was able to actually look at the geometry and then create that map based off of the three-dimensional geometry and not just a two-dimensional map. So, with all that being said, the same adjustments we could do with our bump map, mainly the height scale, can also be done here. So maybe I bump that up to 5. Okay, and things actually look worse. Let's see if we lowering this, and what do you know? We end up with something a bit closer to um, our bump map. They're actually not even quite as good as the bump map. So we'll put that back to 1 and move on to our displacement map. Okay, so here's displacement. It's kind of already set up. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we get. All right. So things went a little bit crazy. Let me kind of break down and go through this since this is already set up. Yeah, I was afraid something would have changed. And I'm not sure how this got a scale of 11, but my guess is that's not the default amount. So if we lower this to say 1, now we're getting something that looks pretty good. I need to put another disclaimer on this though, because um, I already have a Redshift object tag set up here, and the geometry section has already been set up. So this is actually what you would get if you just apply that displacement material to a piece of geometry. Not much. Okay. So without a Redshift object tag, you have to add all of the geometry necessary for a displacement map to work. And that requires a lot of geometry. Okay. In fact, if I was to come in here, I think it's under tools. They keep moving things. Mesh, nope, it's under mesh, subdivide, and come in here and subdivide this a few times. We should start to see some of that detail come through. And I would have to keep doing that over and over again in order to get that displacement map to work. But that's a really inefficient way of doing it since that geometry has to be on this object the entire time. And that's where the Redshift object tag comes in. Okay, now I don't necessarily mean to go over all of this, but you do need to go into the geometry section, check override, okay? And you don't have to do tessellation, but if you don't, then you need to add the geometry you want for this manually, because you'll see just turning this on here isn't going to do a whole lot. And in fact, you may be going, oh, well, it's doing something. That is actually this auto bump mapping, right? We turn off the auto bump mapping and we're pretty much back to square one. So this auto bump mapping is nice, uh, but we can see it's not as good as just our bump map. So we would definitely maybe want to use both. Okay. And we'll come back to these displacement settings because before that, we need to increase the amount of geometry. And by doing this, we're going to make our scene more efficient since the extra polygons and detail geometry, whatever you want to call it, gets added just at render time. In fact, this tessellation option is a replacement for subdivision surface. So you don't really need to use subdivision surfaces if you just use the Redshift object tag and set it up here. Now the settings are a little bit different in here. Okay, we can specify minimum edge length, and the lower we go with that, the more polygons will get created. We can also add a maximum number of subdivisions, and so maybe I can increase that a bit. Both of these settings you do want to be quite careful about adjusting, depending on your computer specs and how much how many other things you have going on in your scene. It's possible you could crash your computer, you could crash Redshift if you turn the minimum edge length too low and the maximum subdivisions too high. Now, we're still not quite there because while we've given this enough geometry, for whatever reason, our map just isn't having the result we want. And now we can come in here and increase the maximum displacement and displacement scale. Okay. Now, you may think these are the same, but they actually are not. And so I like to adjust these individually. We can see this is starting to maybe push things a little bit more. Oops. Okay. Would help if I could type 10. Okay. So really still not too much of a difference, right? So we've given this more room to displace. We just need to increase the scale now as well. And now we're starting to see the things come up. We're, really just increasing the values in our map, almost like we're crunching a levels is the way I like to think of it. And so I did have this at 10 before. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, maybe the displacement scale is all you need. That is not true. If I turn that down to 1, you'll see, we are getting some displacement, but it's very shallow. It's very much like, the normal map here. So it does take, at least with this particular map, every map is going to be different depending on how it was created, the values it has, as well as, is it 32-bit floating point or PNG or whatever. We can also just turn back on auto bump mapping now for us to see. And, looking at this, to me, the sculpted and the displacement look very, very similar. I mean, close to being identical. And so, obviously the displacement's going to win. The displacement, though, as you've seen, is harder to set up. and is going to be harder on your system come render time because there is a lot more geometry associated with it than, say, a normal map or a bump map. But as we start to zoom out here, the differences between these seem to get less and less. It's really at this distance that, if we're just looking at the front, the normal map here looks pretty good. If we zoom out just a bit more, probably, could get away with just a bump map. And that's going to be easier to set up. Well, bump and normal map are pretty much the same in terms of, how taxing it is on your system. It's just whether or not you have both of those or you have the choice between them. Okay, so that is a look at all those different map types, how you can set them up, and if you are starting with a sculpted object, how you can create them. Okay, so hopefully that helps maybe enlighten some people in terms of where you might want to use each type of map. Um, so I mentioned I'll probably do another video where I take a look at how we can work with a sculpted object geometry wise, whether we use a remesher, whether we use a displacer to try and get similar kind of detail, but actually in the geometry and do that as efficiently as possible. So that's all I got for this video. If there's anything else you want to see, please let me know.